provided us. With that, let us start. Basics of BP. BP, by the way, stands for British Parliamentary Debating Format. Before we proceed forward, a little bit of, let us say, story time on this. Across the globe, there are a lot of debating formats. I think India is a very clear and picturesque representation of the sort of prominent debate formats that we generally see across the globe. Indians very wholeheartedly and actively within our own circuit engage with the Asian parliamentary format, British parliamentary format, WSDC format, and also other forms of debating as like, for example, Oxford format, etc. So there are a lot of formats that are there across the globe about debating. As the name suggests, I think Asian parliamentary debating format is a debate format that is prevalent or mostly active around the Asian circuit, where, like, let us say, Asian debaters or Asian teams are more familiar with the format to begin with. And I think that is the format that a lot of you have already gained a lot of experience in, or like probably have at least participated in to a substantial degree. So I think AP is simple to go ahead and understand in one term, and that is that you have one side that is for the motion and the other side that is against the motion. Very simple debating structure. And I think it makes sense as well to a lot of people to initially start with Asian parliamentary debating because of how easy it is to grasp the concept that one team is speaking for, the other team is speaking against. The next thing that comes in as like a responsibility or a factor within AP format is how you engage with speaker roles. So I think once teams are comfortable with the notion of one team is going to support the motion and the other team is going to oppose the motion, then we start teaching them or talking to them about what each of the speaker roles or what each of the speeches signify. Like, for example, what does it mean for you to go prime minister? What does it mean for, let us say, you to go whip? And what's the difference between a whip and a reply speech, etc. So these are clarifications that we keep on providing. Once teams and participants and students who are learning AP are interested and have already inculcated the basic construct that AP is a for versus against debate with, let us say, 3 members on each sides with 4 speeches on each side. So it becomes a bit clearer and easy to go ahead and handle. BP, on the other hand, is not as, let us say, easy to automatically go ahead and think of. It has a lot of unique traits to BP systems that like necessarily no other format reflects. And it is also one of the most prominent debate formats across the world, if not actually the most prominent debate format across the world. So it makes sense if you want to go ahead and engage with British parliamentary debating. It makes sense if you want to go ahead and learn British parliamentary debating. That makes sense because all of these major tournaments that you see happening across the globe, a larger chunk of them are going to be BP format tournaments. And this is the reason why even the world majors like WUDC or even EUDC and even the Asian major ABP follow the British parliamentary system of debating. So there's a lot of engagement and a lot of scope for you to learn BP through these exposures and experiences in vast varied tournaments. But before you hop into these tournaments, it is important for you to get some basics cleared, without which you will not be able to perform to your optimum in tournaments like that. And that is what this particular session is simply about. That is what we want to go ahead and solve for you. The initial bottleneck of understanding a format and familiarizing yourself with it is what the scope of this particular session tries to solve. Let us start then. The first key difference is going to be about motions. Before we even move into the construct of, okay, what are the speeches, what are the themes, etc., we're just going to talk about motions. First of all, motions are not provided in multiple numbers to you. BP tournaments will have one motion per round. So you do not get to choose. Unlike AP structures, you do not get to choose what motion you will debate for the round, or you do not get to veto a particular motion that you do not want to go ahead and debate at all. BP tournaments will go ahead and request you to go ahead and debate on the only motion that they will provide for the tournament to begin with. And that is the motion that you will have to go ahead and engage with for that round. The second thing is on prep time. Preparation time in common AP tournaments is 30 minutes. Preparation time in a lot of other formats also range from, let us say, 20 to 30 minutes or 25 minutes, including, let us say, rankings, etc., or excluding rankings, etc., respectively. Um, BP tournaments, however, per round will only have 15 minutes of prep time. So you're not going to get a huge amount of time to go ahead and engage with preparation. Your preparation needs to happen within a very crisp 15 minutes of time frame, which is probably the most, let us say, demanding part of a BP tournament or a BP format setup that I feel novices and intermediates keep getting, like, let us say, scared by, or keep getting, like, let's say, afraid of. Because the most common question or the most common shock point that I think I find when we talk about BP sessions like these is that it's inherently a bit confusing and a bit, let us say, daunting for teams to go ahead and engage with an entire case from their side with 15 minutes of prep time in their hands. So this is where a lot of things in BP tournaments are more required. Like, you have to be more aware, or let us say more clear about certain things. Like, for example, the strategy that you want to use to create a case, the sort of, let us say, there's a prep time efficiency that you want to hold. Because if you're not very efficient with the prep time is going to get finished pretty quickly, and you'll not be aware of what actually ended up happening. You'll probably not be able to communicate a lot with your teammate, etc., as well. And that is going to go ahead and lead to a lot of issues. The motion being only one, and the fact that you don't really get a lot of choice in motions, or you don't really get to choose motions at all to begin with, is going to go ahead and push you to the mindset of, you need to learn about what these motions are. Like, you necessarily need to be a bit more verbose and bit more well read about whatever is going across the globe, because you largely will not get the option to opt out of debates if you really want to go ahead and do a BP tournament. So for BP tournaments, the first set of preparations, or the first basic thing that you need to have in your mind, is that the prep time is small. The motions are not going to be provided to you to veto. So there's going to be only one motion per round, which means both of these indicate that you have to have synergy within the team, a very clear idea of how you want to move with the prep time, that is prep time efficiency, and a certain capacity to go ahead and know about most of what is happening across the globe, because the motion will not let you go ahead and choose whether you want to debate a particular thing or not. And that is something that I really need you to go ahead and keep in mind. Without this, I think you are likely going to feel a bit daunted in the BP tournament setup. However, now let's move to some common factors. I think the first common factor that I would like to point out here is that both BPs and APs have a 7-minute speech. So it's not like the speech time is increasing or decreasing. It's not like that is going to change as well. So speech times remain the same. POIs still exist. So even in BPs, you have to go ahead and ask POIs. The timings for POIs, the protected timings, etc., for POIs, etc., are also the same. So, like, you have to go ahead and ask the POIs between 1 and 6 minutes. You cannot go ahead and, like, maybe violate these timings, etc., in BP setups as well. So these are the few sections of commonalities that exist between BP and AP. The other thing is, of course, and this is as per tournament policy and is something that should strictly be followed, no sort of internet research is allowed in any sort of debate formats. Debating is largely to be relied upon with your own thought process. You should go ahead and try to focus a lot on generating unique arguments that are organic rather than through the utilization of internet or artificial intelligence, etc. Now, the most important factor in a BP is the way that teams and team dynamics are formed. A team has two speakers, the first and the second speaker, respectively, in their team, and a team only has two speakers. In a BP round, however, you have four teams instead of two teams that you are necessarily used to seeing in almost every other debate format. So, in this particular setup, in a BP tournament, you will have four teams in one room, and in each of the teams, you will have the first speaker and the second speaker, respectively. They have their specific names. We will discuss them right now. First of all, the first team is opening government. You have the second opening opposition. The third is closing government, and the fourth is closing opposition. So you have four teams in a BP room, and all of these teams, there are two speakers. The first speaker from opening government is called the Prime Minister. The second speaker from opening government is called the Deputy Prime Minister. First speaker from opening opposition is called the Leader of Opposition. Second speaker from opening opposition is called the Deputy Leader of Opposition. For the closing government, this is where the closing bench comes in. The closing bench is closing government and closing opposition. The opening bench is opening government and opening opposition. For closing government, the first speaker for closing is called the member of government, and the fourth speaker, or like let us say the second speaker from closing government, or the fourth speaker from the gov bench is gov whip. Similarly, on the opposition side, the first speaker from closing opposition is member of op, and the second speaker from closing opposition is opposition whip, but they are also the third and fourth speakers in the op bench as a whole. So what does this signify? And this is where the structure gets a bit complicated. And this is where I'll spend a little bit time for the benefit of, let us say, people who are first timers for BP debating. The benches are still the same. You have for and against. But in each side, you have two teams now. So earlier, it was that in an AP, you had one team defending for, one team defending against. In BP, you have two teams defending for and two teams defending against. The way that BP works is that you don't win on a bench margin. You don't see necessarily that, okay, which bench as a whole performed better than the other bench. It's a bit complicated than that. BPs follow a ranking system. All the four teams are ranked first to fourth based on certain key metrics that they are able to utilize and solve within the debate. And that is what makes BP structure totally different from other formats. You are ranked first to fourth based on your individual contribution to the debate and the capacity for you to holistically scale and understand the arguments that have been put forth by other teams and utilize strategy to prove why your arguments either supersede or have a tangible benefit over what the rest of the other teams have provided. And this is where there's a certain clever idea that is propagated. There's some amount of house advantages and house disadvantages. All of these four teams, opening government, opening opposition, closing government, and closing opposition, are also called houses, four houses in the debate. Now, if you cluster these houses together in pairs, you're going to get six pairs. Remember, this is important because you'll have to be verbose with these terminologies if you're engaging with BP, be it as a debater or an adjudicator, but also sometimes specifically as an adjudicator. So there are four houses in a BP debate. And if you want to make unique pairs out of these four houses, you will get six unique pairs. The first one will be the opening bench, which is the opening houses together, OG and OO. The second one is the closing bench, and that is the closing government and closing opposition. There's the closing houses together. The third one is the gov bench, which is the opening government and the closing government. The fourth one is the op bench, which is the opening opposition and the closing opposition. I think till here it's all pretty fine because it's all pretty stable, etc. as well, right? Now comes a bit of a complicated part. There are two diagonals in this particular matrix setup. The first is the long diagonal. Long diagonal, why? Because the first speaker and the first team engages with the last speaker and the last team that gets to put their speeches in the debate, which is OG and CO. So OGCO is called the long diagonal, and OOCG, which is opening opposition and closing government, is called the short diagonal. So there are six bench pairs, and these are called bench comparisons as well. You do these six bench comparisons as an adjudicator to come to a BP judgment. When you give an oral adjudication, you're also expected to highlight the six bench comparisons and explain your call accordingly. These are the six unique bench comparisons that you can get in a BP room with four teams. Keep this in mind because this becomes important later. Each of the speakers in these benches have a very specific role to fulfill. Now, before I move on to role fulfillment, which is going to be an entirely different segment that we'll discuss right now, let us go ahead and have a brief Q&A session for 2 minutes. Any questions, you can drop them in the chat space, or you can go ahead and unmute and ask. I'll just wait for 2 minutes for you to go through whatever I've already spoken. Yes, for sure. To repeat the pairing part, the construct of pairing is that if there are four teams in a BP room, you can uniquely pair them up in 6 ways. And these 6 ways are called the six bench comparisons that adjudicators commonly utilize to come to a call or come to a ranking for the four teams in the room. And that six bench comparison happens in this manner. First, you have the opening bench. Second, you have the closing bench. The opening bench is OG and OO. The closing bench is CG and CO. Simple. The next you have is the gov bench, which is OG and CG. And then you have the op bench, which is OO and CO. Simple. Now you have a little bit of complicacy in the last two benches, which are the diagonals. So if you look at this matrix, if you put OG, OO, CG, CO in a matrix format, the diagonals of the matrix will be, the long diagonal would be opening government and closing opposition, because the first speaker of this particular debate room is opening government's first speaker, and the last speaker of this debate room is the closing opposition's last speaker, which is opvip. So the diagonal is the long diagonal here, which is OGCO, and then the short diagonal, which is the other diagonal, that is OOCG, opening opposition and closing government. That's all. Think of both the teams as 4 points on a square cube. Now, if you were to uniquely attach all these points to each other, then you would come up with all of these six linkages that we just talked about. The first one will be the linkage between the opening half, there is OGOO. Second one will be the linkage between the closing half, CGCO. The third one will be the OGCG, which is the gov bench linkage. The fourth one will be the OOCO, which is the op bench linkage. The fifth one will be the OGCO, and the sixth one will be the OOCG, the diagonals. That's all. Cool. We'll move forward with the discussion. Moving on to the next slide for the speaker roles. Now, each role in the BP setup typically has a very unique impact or input to provide in the debate. And we'll talk about all of those right now. The prime minister role is pretty similar to how an AP prime minister setup works, or how a prime minister setup in general works, which is that the prime minister has to put the first substantive argument in favor of the motion. You'll also have to go ahead and set up the base frame for the debate. You talk about what are the basic necessities that you need. You talk about, maybe if it's a policy debate, you provide the policy. If it's a regrets debate, then you provide the regret metric, you provide the counterfactual. If it's a counterfactual heavy debate, you also provide the counterfactual as well here. If it's a worldview debate, like let's say THP, a world, etc., or something, then you also provide the worldview analysis here. So all of these things happen within the particular debate that you have right now. This all should ideally come from the first speaker speeches, right? Where you go ahead and talk about the first speaker analysis, and the first speaker will go ahead and provide maybe one or two arguments as well, things that go ahead and benefit your case. Like, for example, the argument can go ahead and support or provide reasons for why you support the worldview, or why you support the policy, or why you think you can get the benefit out of the policy, etc., etc., right? These are the things. Now, the next thing that we'll go ahead and talk about is what the second role for the first speaker is. The second role is to preempt possible counter arguments. The possible counter arguments from general opposition teams can be considered in this particular debate. So, like for example, you think that the opposition is likely going to bring something of, like, let us say, a particular analysis. You can go ahead and try to counter that preemptively. You can try to go ahead and add a potential rebuttal and reinforce the government's case by talking about what preemptively the case from opposition should look like and why you think that you still have a benefit over the opposition. It's a bit of a strategic weighing that your first speaker can do in this particular regard. Moving to the next slide on the second role, the role of leader of opposition, dynamically very similar to go ahead and engage with in terms of the first speaker role as well. um, the next thing is to respond to the prime minister's argument through targeted rebuttals and challenging their reasonings and frameworks. Few things to keep in mind: any sort of definitional challenges that you want to go ahead and provide must be provided in the first speech. You have to establish why the definitional challenge needs to exist. You have to go ahead and establish how the definitional challenge affects the debate and why it narrows the scope of the debate and how you wish to solve the definitional challenge with a counter definition of your own. These are the important things that you have to go ahead and provide for this debate to exist, right? From LO, if you want to go ahead and engage with a definitional challenge, or if you want to go ahead and engage with something that probably benefits you as a definition or is a more holistic definition, and you think like the other side has just tried to narrow or skew a particular definition just because they can, or are just being uncharitable to the debate, etc., you need to point this out in the first speech from opposition itself, and you need to go ahead and clearly give a call out for the same in the first speech itself. The rest other factors are pretty similar. You have to go ahead and give your framing, you have to go ahead and give your policy, you have to go ahead and give your let's say setup, maybe worldview analysis if you have a counterfactual world to begin with as well. Otherwise, if you're defending status quo, you talk about what status quo looks like. You give 1 to 2 arguments on why you are defending the side that you are and how necessarily you're able to benefit the side that you're defending to begin with. All of these things fall under the similar scope of what prime minister does for their side, and hence is similar to what the leader of opposition goes ahead and engages with as well. One added benefit here is that you also get to engage with and respond to the prime minister's framework and the prime minister's argument. So you can use targeted rebuttals. You can just go ahead and challenge the entirety of their reasoning and their framework, and you can go ahead and make that a premise for how you wish to go ahead and shape the debate henceforth. A structured targeted rebuttal here, or a number of rebuttals here, can make sure that the prime minister's case is probably not as let's say justifiably fair after your rebuttals are done, etc., which means that you are now easily able to allow your deputy more room to maneuver in terms of how they wish to either take over from the speaker, and either like take over from the next speaker, which is deputy prime minister, or like outright win the debate round as well, at least in the opening half as well, if they are very precise with what they wish to prove. So these are certain things that also get reflected through house advantages. But yes, one of the easiest ways from opening opposition to get a victory, or to at least stand a chance in a victory in a room, is to directly engage with the discussion of what the prime minister already talks about, and go ahead and probably respond to or at least engage with the same to a degree from your side of the paradigm. Cool. Now moving on to the next speaker role. Next slide, please. The role of deputies. Now, both the deputies, deputy prime minister and deputy leader of opposition, share very similar responsibilities, just like how leader of opposition and prime minister do as well to a degree. So, in the deputy speeches, the key responsibility that you have is to try and extend the case above and beyond what the prime minister has already established or what the leader of opposition has already established. So you're probably talking about, let us say, more arguments, or you go ahead and try to respond to the attacks that have already been put forth from the other side. So you try to mitigate those attacks, minimize the damage, or try to re-establish your case or re-establish your argument and why you think that your argument still stands, etc. So that benefit of proving why your argument can still stand substantially in the room is something that the deputies have the privilege of engaging with. Note, however, Since deputy leader of opposition goes after the deputy prime minister, the deputy leader of opposition still has one more attempt to go ahead and make sure that the arguments from the entirety of opening government can be refuted and taken down, because they have one more speech remaining, and opening government would not be able to respond via a constructive speech because they don't have any more constructive speeches in this particular regard. So that's one thing that I wanted to note as well in terms of house benefits or house advantages that you can go ahead and utilize or afford from a setup like this. Deputies also provide one or two new arguments that necessarily strengthen their side's position while also making sure that they have relevance in the debate overall. Another cool impacting factor here: Deputy Prime Minister gets to respond to the questions on challenges of any definitional nature. So they get to respond to these definitional challenges. They get to go ahead and respond and defend their own definitions, etc. To begin with. Now, let us say that Deputy Leader of Opposition is still not happy with the justification, or op bench still as a whole thinks that the justification does not just provide a fair enough reasoning for why the definition from their side is valid and fair and should be allowed, then DLO still has the capacity and the liberty to call out their definition, but does not have the liberty or the capacity to just go ahead and talk about the debate from their definitional standpoint. So, how you have to do it is you have to go ahead and include an even if argument or an even if analysis. An even if argument similarly just talks about you having to respond to their arguments within their frame charitably. That is, in simple ways, it says that you go ahead and first talk about why the definitional challenge and the resultant response from Deputy Prime Minister still is not a valid and fair response, and hence your definition should be allowed to be remaining or established, etc. And you go ahead and build your arguments on the same. But after you are done with that, you still loop back to the first speaker arguments or the second speaker arguments from the other side and give an even if response where you say, even if we assume their definition holds true, here are the reasons why we still can beat them due to these particular fallacies or due to these particular rebuttals. And this is what your entire construct of a discussion on an even if argument allows you. It allows you some amount of charitability. In case the judge is not willing to opt into the argument of a definitional challenge existing, in case the judge thinks that the definitional challenge is not, let us say, the most fair thing to do at that moment, then I think that it becomes strategically better for you if you're able to prove on an even if why your argument still has the capacity to generate the same impacts as the impacts that they are able to generate in the first instance itself on your own argumentative analysis itself or on your definitional analysis itself. So this is a strategic value that you can utilize. However, reminder, a lot of the times I feel like deputy leaders of opposition just continue arguing on the base framework or the definitions and continue to try and disprove the definitions from the other side. That is fair, but that is still not enough for you to win around. It is still going to be necessary for you to engage with their argument on even if analysis in case the proposition does not engage with the definitional challenge and does not go ahead and accept or concede to the same. And in case the judge also does not think that the definitional challenge was valid and fair to begin with in the first place. So in case these situations are likely to happen, the strategic value that you can afford here is to go ahead and engage with the entire discussion of even if arguments existing. So try to inculcate even if arguments in deputy leader of opposition speech. Now, moving on to the next role, and this is arguably one of the most key roles in this particular debate. Role of member of government. Member of government has a very key structure to play in this particular regard. Member of government is likely going to first extend the case from the government bench and is going to go ahead and present something that is new and at the same time overall relevant to the debate. So we are talking about not just, let us say, simple analysis on terms of, oh, these are the reasons why the opening government's argument are valid or like stand the test or whatever. You also go ahead and try to extend on the debate from one side by giving some unique arguments from your side that explains why you have a unique perspective in the debate. Two things to note here: closings can take over openings, especially and only when they are able to prove to a greater degree that they have a clear extension. Extension is a clear new argument um, over and beyond what the opening side is able to provide. And if they are able to clearly weigh that out as an impact from the VIP speaker from their end, both of these things likely contribute to a far greater degree to the sort of argumentative value that you are able to generate or derive from your speeches, or the argumentative value that you're likely able to get from the closing half. So two things that you have to go ahead and um, engage with from member of government, first of all, is try to rebuild and defend the opening half's case, because deputy leader of opposition has probably responded to a lot of or a huge chunk of it. Engage with the opposition as a whole, like engage with whatever the leader of opposition and deputy leader of opposition have provided to you in this debate. Ensure that your arguments are distinct and unique, and they do not just merely repeat it, because this is what your individual unique contribution to the debate is, and this is what will decide or determine your ranking of within all the four teams that are there, and contribute to the overall narrative and strategy of the government bench. Now, when we talk about the narrative and strategy, we want to point out you should not be knifing your prior speakers, and you should not be trying to change the entire base framework of whatever your prior speakers have already established. We will talk about this particular segment a little later as well when we engage with that. But now, moving to the member of opposition speech. Member of opposition. Member of opposition has largely the same sort of argumentative requirements as, let us say, member of government. You have to go ahead and present new and unique arguments that strengthen the op bench, of course. You refute the sort of arguments that you've already gotten from the gov bench. Like, for example, you engage with the new argumentative extension from closing government, that is. You go ahead and try to engage with the entire discussion on why the closing government's argument either is actually more valuable than the opening government, or is probably not as valuable as they think it is, and you try to prove or disprove that accordingly. The next thing that you do is you try to establish your own argumentative extension, where you talk about, okay, this is the clear extension from our side, like this is the clear let's say argument that we want to take through with the debate from our side. And the same rules apply here as well, like the same rules in terms of the fact that, okay, you have to go ahead and like probably provide more sort of an analysis that is still similar to the entire argumentative setup that you have from the opening opposition, etc. You have to also support and defend the entire opposition case as a whole. Your extension should add value by introducing some sort of new or fresh perspective, and you should also maintain clear engagement with the motion and with like the overall narrative that the debate is able to propagate to begin with in the first place. This is similar to what the gov member does, but at the same time, there are going to be some sort of clarificative differences that exist. You also have to play this very strategically to go ahead and ensure a victory in this round as well. So these are the certain things that the member speeches are likely supposed to do. Maintain this sort of a clear engagement, however, at any or all points in time. Now, moving to the next speakers, where's the VIP speakers. Now, something that you have to go ahead and talk about here. VIPs necessarily go ahead and provide a summary of the debate from their side, but mostly from their side's perspective. And I think a lot of the whips just inherently assume that you're just supposed to summarize the arguments, and that's it. And they try to go ahead and just concisely summarize everything that's been discussed so far. But that is not the inherent role of what a whip speaker is supposed to do. A whip speaker is also supposed to go ahead and not just summarize the arguments, provide a perspective from their side, a biased perspective or a biased adjudication from their side in terms of why they think that their side is far better able to engage with the burden of the debate and is far better able to holistically win over the other side as well. This is how you go ahead and address things like the key clashes in the debate. You go ahead and address, let's say, rebuilding and defending your entire side, or like responding to whatever the other side's common or prominent arguments are, etc. You go ahead and try to deliver a clear but very persuasive narrative of what you necessarily think happens from your entire bench and how that is beneficial for your entire bench as a whole. You also try to provide these clash analysis in a manner that allows you to engage with the entire discussion of rankings. So you try to provide rankings from your side as well, to go ahead and explain why you think one team's contributions individually are more valuable or inherently outweigh what the other contributions from other teams have been throughout the debate. All of these things are what whip speakers are largely allowed to go ahead and engage with. What I think whip speakers are to a degree restricted with is newer arguments, like totally new arguments that are not necessarily, let us say, elaborated or at least slightly introduced. And these are things that you have to go ahead and keep in mind in general for whip speeches in to begin with in the first place. I think that is largely what the role fulfillment debate, or like the role fulfillment within like a BP tournament setup, let's say, looks like. And I think this is what we largely want to go ahead and talk about when we deal with each of these roles. A lot of what the BP roles are about is about strategy. You have to go ahead and utilize robust strategic ideas to go ahead and engage with the entire construct of the debate, because the debate is flowing very dynamically. The roles of the closing teams is to extend in a unique manner over and beyond the opening teams. And the judges are very surely noting whether you're able to actually extend beyond whatever opening says. And it's not just on extending on argumentative depth or argumentative value. It is proving that your argument has more impact or more value generation for the debate than your previous bench's arguments, etc. But you have to do it strategically without either knifing or directly refuting the arguments from the prior speakers of your side. These are things that you have to keep in mind. Now, in general, what are the motion types that we generally see in BP tournaments? This is also very similar to whatever we have earlier engaged with in previous tournament styles. Next slide, please. Yes. So the most common motion types that are there, I think you're largely aware of these. The policy motions, THW, value judgment motions like THS, THO, TH prefers, THBT, regrets motion also, THR. You have actor motions, this house as X, etc. Mostly it would be like this house as X would do something. Predicts motions are also a new addition to how BP motions are engaged with. This house predicts. All of these motion types can be asked for clarifications by your CAP at any tournament. Whenever you are in a tournament on Discord or Zoom, or let us say if you're in person, then you can ask them. So make sure that you necessarily need to be very charitable with the sort of characterizations that you do in a debate. A lot of the arguments, a lot of the motions that inherently are followed through with are necessarily requiring a lot of characterizations to begin with. And you are not likely to go ahead and get direct, clear answers of, oh, this is the direction that the debate is supposed to take. Since there are more than one lines of argumentation, and because BP teams or BP format prioritizes multiple lines of argumentations that are unique to each other, you are likely to be allowed to characterize the debate in a manner that beneficially supports the same to begin with in the first place. Just a sec. I think there's someone unmuted or something. Yep. Uh, Ashirvad, can you mute out the? Yeah, thank you so much. Okay, continuing forward. So I think the way that this works and the sort of benefit that it's able to provide to you is the fact that you have the capacity to engage with new and unique argumentations to begin with in the first place. Now, let us go ahead and talk about the next important thing, or the next most valuable thing here, which is an extension. Because I think a lot of people have a confusion on extensions. Next slide. Yes, extensions. So, what are extensions? Extensions are necessarily things that do not come in your previous segment of discussion. So, like, it can be a newer argument, it can be a new rebuttal, it can be a new analysis, it can also be in the form of a new example, it can be some amount of a new metric or a criteria as well. As long as you are able to prove your extension as original, well proven, important to the debate, you are likely going to stand relevance for the round, and hence are likely going to be able to positively contribute to your side's case being more fulfilled, etc., to begin with. So, an extension is simply talking about something that has not been spoken about, but at the same time is something that should be valuable to the discussion in the debate. That is simply what an extension is all about. And this is something that a lot of people need to keep in mind, because I've seen a lot of novices or first timers, or like, let's say, a lot of intermediate speakers as well, in closing halves, just go ahead and reiterate the prior opening halves arguments or discussions in like maybe a different manner or maybe in a different way, but not really go ahead and provide like a clear unique extension or a clear unique structure that takes them above and beyond what their opening has talked about. So remember, the emphasis on an extension is that it needs to be original. It cannot be an extension of the same argument from, let us say, the previous speakers on your bench. It has to be totally original, and it also has to have a unique edge to it. Ideally, it's looking towards a unique impact analysis as well, so that you can go ahead and totally segregate the sort of impact that you're able to derive out of that argument within a debate. Now, let us move to the second most important part here, which is to go ahead and engage with overall other rules of the discussion. Few things to keep in mind here. Number one, that knifing is something that happens and is something that is looked down upon to a degree. It is not supposed to happen at all. Try your best to not knife the teams that are there, let us say, with your own openings. For example, closing teams, you have to be consistent with your opening teams. You have to make sure that you don't necessarily violate what your opening team is going to go ahead and engage with in the first place. You have to go ahead and make sure that you don't respond to that in a manner that is going to sound like a rebuttal, or you don't go ahead and put a direct disagreement to, let us say, the entire existence of their setup, unless it is clearly a false factual claim, or it is some sort of squirreling that has happened in this particular setup. This is something that you have to go ahead and keep in mind whenever you're engaging with a debate. Try your best when you're trying to prove that, okay, this is like, let us say, what our extension is, and this is why we are able to better accrue a sort of impact. Don't try to justify that by disproving what the other speakers from your opening bench were able to prove as impacts. So don't try to go ahead and do that. Try to holistically prove why your argument has a greater scope of impact than, let us say, the argument that comes from your opening. So knifing necessarily means that you cannot go ahead and be inconsistent with your opening teams to a degree, as long as your opening teams were fair and charitable with the setup that they have made. Unless their setup is extremely problematic, which is like, for example, they have a false factual claim, or like a false claim overall, or like a very heavily squirreling the debate, etc., and hence you're able to justify that change, then you can go ahead and change the direction and talk about the entire construct of the setup for the debate. You can also disagree about prioritization. So let us say opening says that they prioritize their argument A as the most important priority. You are not expected to go ahead and fulfill that. Prioritization of argument A is the utmost important thing for the bench as a whole. You can prioritize other arguments. In fact, this is going to be the next important factor here as well, because as closing, if you want to beat your own opening, you have to explain why your argument needs to be prioritized more than the opening's argument, or why the impact of your argument is more than whatever the opening's argument is, without directly refuting or responding to the opening in a rebuttal style manner. This is the This is the fine line or the fine print that you have to follow in terms of how you wish to strategically engage with the debate as a closing team. This makes it a bit tricky in terms of how you wish to phrase it, how you wish to frame your words in the argument. But this is where the actual structure analysis comes, or the actual analysis of strategy comes in, because you're now able to better utilize strategy to make sure that your responses are strategically directed towards how you engage with the discussion and how you try to justify your value within the debate overall, without going ahead and refuting or maybe even taking down what the opening team says, even though your opening to a degree might not have, let us say, the best frames to begin with in the debate, etc. Now let's talk about new material. For the purpose of this debate, most of what is new material is something that's like a new weighing, framing, or like a direct rebuttal, and impacting is something that is like you have to go ahead and engage with. For example, if you're trying to go ahead and bring an entirely new construct of framing, like you try to reframe the debate overall, you are likely to go ahead and violate the rules of new material, because you are now creating a new analysis in the entire debate altogether, something that is inconsistent with, let us say, a lot of the prior discussion. So what happens here is that you are not allowing charitable scope for other speakers from other teams to go ahead and engage with the discourse to begin with, which means that this is where you necessarily have, like, let us say, an issue with regards to new material being like maybe not as well accommodated in this sort of a setup to begin with in the first place. But at the same time, you can go ahead and engage with the sort of existent weighings. You can go ahead and engage with some amount of new weighing metrics as well. But it should not be totally new to the point that, let us say, the weighing metric is something that largely talks about things that are above and beyond whatever the debate has been about, etc. To begin with, you can still go ahead and engage with, let us say, direct rebuttals and impactings to begin with, because direct rebuttals and impactings are fair. You can go ahead and provide direct rebuttals and impacting of any of the arguments from any of the teams. What I think total new material then looks like is something that has no previous engagement in this particular round and somehow becomes a new constructive on a positive material. That is what the new material looks like, and that is what the new material should not necessarily go ahead and be introduced in a whip speech in this particular regard. So you're necessarily not including things like, let's say, an entirely new weighing metric overall, which is like linked to maybe an entirely new framing, which is like probably linked to an entirely new argument that is coming from the very end of your speech, etc. All of these things can be problematic and can create some amount of charitability issues, which is like, even if the argument is valuable, valid, etc., to what degree can it be credited, etc. Now let's talk about burdens. I think overall burdens or teams cannot be, let us say, simply created by the other team just because of the fact the other team asserts that they exist. You should not necessarily have to accept these assertions as well, be it whether you're a judge or a team. But at the same time, you have to holistically understand what the burden from your side looks like and how are you able to fulfill that burden from your side to begin with in the first place. These are things that you have to keep in mind. These are the some certain other rules. But yes, of course, POIs, like we mentioned, exist in the same manner as they do in other speaker, let's say, in other sort of speaking formats, debating formats specifically, which is like you ask the people POIs questions about their debates, first to 6 minutes of their speeches, etc. And you can ask a POI for up to 15 seconds only. And debaters are generally expected to accept at least a POI, and they can go ahead and take at least 2 to 3 POIs in the entire bench, both speakers considered, etc. Which means that you cannot go ahead and talk about, let us say, your own case constructive or something like that from your POI or whatever. Your POIs should very simply go ahead and ask a very clear question. So it should not be like a coded POI either. Like, for example, somebody is speaking and you immediately stand up and like, on this, a POI. You cannot go ahead and do something like that. Neither can you do things like, let us say, points of clarifications on, like, let us say, why you want to clarify certain aspects of the model, etc. It has to be directly a question and it has to be fair and stated. So tracking and evaluating POIs is also something that judges go ahead and engage with. If a person is taking more than 15 seconds, judge can call order and of course stop you from like providing that POI extent to that extent, right? You have to go ahead and make sure that you're engaging with these POIs in a holistic manner because they're evaluated. Because if you do not engage with POIs, it is assumed to be a reduced level of engagement. A reduced level of engagement can tangibly contribute to, let us say, the sort of rankings that happen in a debate, especially in very close call, let us say, POI analysis that you have. Good question on this a point POI. The sort of POIs that, let us say, if somebody is talking about, let's say, maybe a law, somebody is talking about maybe, let us say, some sort of a specific construct that already exists in status quo, etc., and you immediately stand up and you're like on this a POI. So like directly trying to code the POI into, like, let us say, about a specific thing, etc., that is not allowed. So you can only say things like POI and that's it, and let it be, because the team has to decide whether they wish to take a POI or not. And then you also have like the liberty to ask a POI about anything that they have already like engaged with, touched upon, or like are supposed to touch upon in the debate from their side. Things like that. Evaluation of the quality of POIs and the responses of POIs is what the judges are supposed to do. So judges will likely go ahead and try to frame out what necessarily the entire evaluative content looks like. So they are going to go ahead and engage with the entire discussion of what the POI construct looks like or what the POI setup looks like, and they'll try to respond to that. This is what the judges will try to evaluate. If the teams are not able to, let us say, engage with a POI, like they are not like taking a POI or they've taken a POI and not responded, etc., this is going to go ahead and negatively impact them to a degree. It's not going to directly negative impact by like tangibly tanking your scores or something like that, but it negatively impacts the point of engagement that you're expected to go ahead and fulfill to a degree to begin with in the first place. This is what taking and expecting accepting POIs in general, in terms of engagement in a BPA debate, is all about. So this is where we kind of end the session on the introduction to BP, because I think we have largely covered a lot of what BP structure necessarily fulfills. So Ashirvad, I think you can stop presenting your screen as well. So thank you so much everyone for joining in for the session. This was really a lovely time for me to go ahead and engage with the session. I hope that you all were also able to learn some tangible good things from this particular session. I hope you're able to go ahead and engage with this particular session in a very holistic manner. You are also like very free to ask me any particular questions, any particular clarifications. You can go ahead and like maybe I'll just take maybe a few questions or a few queries right now, but we'll also go ahead and take like a lot more questions, queries via chat. So you can just go ahead and like drop me a text. I would feel free to reach out back to you with a response, etc. But before that, yes, 5 minutes of Q&A before we wrap up the session. Yeah, let us go by the questions one by one in the chat space. As a whip, do you build your own case only or support the other team in the same bench as well? So you're kind of expected to do both. If, let us say, your opening half is, let us say, suffering from a lot of responses, etc., since your case is also to a degree dependent on what the opening half provides in this particular setup, you also have to go ahead and support the other, like, let us say, case that also comes from your opening side. But you also try to definitely prioritize your own case or definitely prioritize the responses in your own side in the first place to begin with. Let us look at the next question. The next question is about opening gov and closing gov prep separately during prep time, right? Yes. Is the closing gov supposed to come up with new arguments while listening to opening gov? So a lot of the times what happens is this is the tricky part. How are you supposed to go ahead and understand whether the argument that you are thinking of right now is new or not? You kind of really don't. You wait till the debate starts, you listen to your opening, and you understand that, okay, whether the argument that you were thinking of was covered already in the opening or not. And it is not just about arguments, it's also about arguments, new impacts, new analysis in the debate, etc. You can expand an existing argument as well, but if you expand its impact enough, then you can also go ahead and track that as a new unique contribution to the scope of the debate from their side. So even that exists. So there are multiple ways to engage with this, but yes, what closing teams in a debate are expected to do is expected to have a gross idea of what are the sort of arguments that can be run, and hence choose the sort of arguments that they wish to run that have not been run by the opening half to begin with. So to a degree, your new argument is reliant on listening to what the previous bench has already talked about. So you have to listen to the opening half to have a clarity at least on whether your argument is new or does it have a new impact to begin with in the first place. Now, moving to the next question, how are teams ranked realistically in any BP round? Like, what are the metrics? So, the metrics of ranking, and this is where we are talking about BP judgment, it is based on individual contribution and persuasiveness. So, the BP manual talks about persuasiveness and individual contribution of teams. So, like, for example, you can go ahead and engage with the discussion of how persuasive you are with your arguments and why is your individual contribution as an argument valuable to the entire debate, maybe above and beyond whatever you already have from the previous debates or like this or from the previous speeches that have happened within the debate, right? This is what you have to go ahead and prove. And this is how your team is ideally ranked. If your contribution or if your argument is, as I say, probably the most important or is able to come closest to the analysis that you have as what the burden for the debate should look like, I think then you are able to go ahead and stand a chance to get the first in this particular debate. Or what you can go ahead and do is you go ahead and try to prove why your argument is more valuable than every other team's, and then justify by weighing or by rebuttal why your team is able to take the first in this debate, which is totally the responsibility of what, let us say, the whip speaker looks like. Now, moving to the next question. If I am in a closing bench and my opening bench misses the core clashes and runs a weaker and more tangential case, then how do I extend the argument without it looking like we are implicitly knifing their entire framework? Very lovely question. In this regard, then, you have to be open about it and explain why you think that the scope of the discussion that is coming from opening bench is probably a bit constrained, and hence you're not really rebutting the opening bench but talking about why you think that the wider scope of debate necessarily needs to be extended upon. So you don't frame it like opening bench does not talk about enough things. You frame it like our burden of proof is larger, we inherently wish to expand the debate, and these are the reasons why the expansion from our side is valid and why we are able to better satisfy and justify the core construct of the debate, etc., to begin with. This is how you avoid knifing your opening, but at the same time, you're able to expand the scope of argumentation as well. At the same time, then you're not really expected to go ahead and, like, I don't know, defend every argument from the opening, etc., to begin with either. You can just largely talk about why their segment of a case or their segment of the debate is probably a very specific segment overall of the burden fulfillment, but at the same time you can also have like maybe a tangentially different burden, as long as you're able to justify why your burden is more close to the crux of the debate and hence is more relevant to the overall scale of the debate as well, as long as it does not go directly against whatever your opening has already talked about. Can CG ask POIs to OG? Very cool question. POIs within the same bench of opposition and government are not allowed. That is, you cannot go ahead and ask your closing or your opening a POI. Your closing means OG cannot ask CG a POI, and CG cannot ask a POI to OG. O cannot ask CO a POI, and neither can CO ask a POI to O. That's it. You can ask POIs across the diagonal and the in the opposite benches. That's how the POI system works. So OO can ask POIs to both OG and CG. Same while CO can ask to both OG and CG, and OG can ask to OO and CO, and CG can also ask to OO and CO. So you can only ask POIs to the opposing benches. As a closing bench, if an opening bench does a poor job or something we don't agree with, is it strategically safer for closing bench to run a vertical extension or running a horizontal extension covering more broader scope? I think almost always try to run more of a horizontal extension that covers more broader scopes within the debate. Let us say, as long as you are not totally sure that a vertical can or will probably knife the entire construct of the discussion. So make sure that you make that justification or like a decision on how much can you actually justify that in a very clear manner to the judge without making it sound like a knife or without making it sound like a trade-off that you're trying to take. Either of those two can be problematic. As long as that is not the case, I think you're good to go. Any tips and strategies on case prep for both closing and opening? Tips and strategies on case prep for closing and opening would be simple. Number one, try your best to go ahead and understand what the scope of burden for the debate looks like. So try your best to go ahead and understand what, like, let us say, the burden of proof is from your side, and what are the overall tangible number of arguments that you can go ahead and think of from your side for this particular debate,
And then let's just try to prioritize what you think would already come from the opening side and what you think would already come from the closing side from your speech, etc. You need to go ahead and engage with the entire discussion of how you try to prioritize certain impacts as well. You can talk about things like actor analysis, stakeholder analysis, that just say all of these things are also important factors that you can go ahead and take into consideration here. So all of these things will come up in your case prep. So just know what are the right questions to ask, because you get that practice eventually. You'll start, like, let us say, engaging with the discussion more, and you'll know what are the right questions to ask as well, and you will be able to strategically prioritize content in the case prep. So you're not really going to go ahead and immediately jump into maybe one or two or few other questions, etc., to begin with in the first place. So try your best to go ahead and not just narrow down your entire case prep to a particular, let us say, uh, how do I say it, to a particular analysis, and just go ahead and think like, okay, this is the argumentative analysis that we are going to go ahead and just focus upon. You will go ahead and try to focus on um, more like having a series or a bunch of new arguments, etc. as well. Last question that I'll go ahead and take, and I think that is the last question here as well. Yeah. What's the vertical and horizontal extension? So mostly when we are talking about vertical extensions deepen the cases, horizontal extensions broaden the cases. That's it. Very simply, horizontal extensions build outwards, they bring an entire new dimension or a new argument. Vertical extensions build downwards. They basically go ahead and talk about a greater depth of what the similar argument looks like. That's all. I think that is all in terms of questions. If you have any other questions that you wish to go ahead and put forth, please feel free to reach out to me via DMs. I think Harsh or Ashirwad, any of them would be very happy to provide you with my contact, etc. if you don't have it already. And if you are in any of the prominent debating groups, you can find like in this particular setup, you can find like an extra yeah, if you are in any of the other groups, I think you can find like an extra way to go ahead and reach out to me by dropping me a text. You will find my contact details in almost every debating group. So you can go ahead and just search up my name, same name as here, and you will find my contact details probably. And in case you don't, just always reach out to Clarion. I think they would be very happy to provide my contact details. That's it from my side. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining in. I think it was a really lovely session. I was very happy with the number of questions, the number of engagement, the amount of engagement that I had. So, yeah, thank you so much for joining in. That's it from our side. I think all of us can disperse now. Have a great evening.